The most powerful military organization in the Middle East is not fighting its enemies right now. It is fighting itself. And the target it has chosen is the one man it was built to protect forever. This has never happened before, not once in 47 years. And once you understand what triggered it, you will never look at Iran the same way again. If you follow geopolitics, international security, or the Middle East, you need to be here right now because what is happening inside Iran is moving faster than any news cycle can contain. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single daily update as this situation develops. This is not background noise, this is history in motion. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, spent 4 decades as the Islamic Republic's iron spine. It crushed the Green Movement in 2009. It survived sanctions, assassinations, and missile strikes. It outlasted every uprising, every threat, every challenger. It was not merely a military force. It was the living proof that the regime could not be broken. That identity, that psychological armor, is now cracking from the inside. And the crack did not begin with a bomb. It began with a tweet. On April 17th, Iran's foreign minister posted on X that all commercial vessel passage through the Strait of Hormuz had been fully restored. No agreement, no deal, no guarantee extracted in return. The Strait of Hormuz, the single most powerful economic pressure card Iran held over the United States and global oil markets, was handed back quietly, unilaterally, in a social media post. And Iran did not explode from outside pressure, it exploded from within. The strait was never just a waterway. As long as it remained closed or threatened, oil prices climbed, Washington felt economic pain, and Iran had a seat at every table that mattered. The moment it reopened without extracting a single concession, Iran lost its leverage, its seat, and the credibility of everything its people had been told for decades about what resistance was building toward. Within hours, IRGC-linked media was calling the foreign minister a traitor. Hardline commentators on state television said he had shown flexibility on Hezbollah's funding, on Hamas support, on the very commitments the regime had told its own people were permanently non-negotiable. Since that moment, the foreign minister has not appeared in public once. But that was only the surface of what was beginning to unravel, because then Trump responded. Not with gratitude, not with a reciprocal gesture. He announced that Iran had agreed to halt uranium enrichment entirely. Iranian officials immediately said the statement was either fabricated or a deliberate distortion. But here is the thing that made it catastrophic, regardless of whether it was true. Regime insiders saw it as proof they had been outmaneuvered. Iran surrendered its card, received nothing in return, and then got publicly misrepresented in a way it could not effectively deny without deepening the appearance of weakness. And in that single sequence of events, 3 separate internal wars ignited at once. Pay close attention here, because most analysts are only talking about one of them. The first war is between the IRGC and what remains of the civilian government. President Pezeshkian, elected on a platform of moderation and reform, has been systematically hollowed out from within. He cannot form his own cabinet without IRGC approval. When he attempted to issue a diplomatic apology to Gulf states in March, IRGC commanders publicly contradicted and overruled him within hours. The elected president of Iran was openly reversed by an unelected military commander in front of the entire watching world. That is not a political disagreement. That is a slow-motion coup. And the coup has already produced its outcome. Without announcement, without ceremony, without any formal transition, a 3-person committee of IRGC origin has assumed operational control of the Iranian state. Vahedi, the IRGC supreme commander, now functions as Iran's de facto ruler. Zolgadar, the National Security Council secretary, whose appointment was forced onto the president under military pressure. And Mohsen Rezai, one of the founding commanders of the IRGC, who spent 16 years leading the organization and now serves as supreme military advisor. Not one of them was elected. Not one of them is a cleric. All 3 were forged in the Iran-Iraq War, in the construction of Hezbollah, in the nuclear standoffs of the 2000s. They do not understand compromise. They were not designed for it. The second war is between the clergy and the IRGC, and this one cuts to the theological core of what the Islamic Republic was always supposed to be. The clerics built this state. The 1979 revolution was their revolution. The doctrine of velayat-e-faqih, governance by the supreme Islamic jurist, was their theological invention, the justification for every execution, every suppression, every war fought in God's name. But now, for the first time, an IRGC origin committee is running the country without them, and the clerics have arrived at a realization that is, for them, genuinely terrifying. If the Islamic Republic can continue to function, or at least persist, without Islamic clerical authority, then the Islamic component of this republic was always window dressing. The theocracy is becoming a military dictatorship, not gradually, visibly, now. And the men who built it are watching it happen without the power to stop it. The third war is on the streets, and this is where it becomes something different entirely. The people filling the streets of Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, and more than 200 cities across all 31 provinces are not the regime's traditional opponents. They are, or they were, the regime's own base. The families who sent sons to the front lines during the Iran-Iraq War. The communities that absorbed 3 decades of economic punishment because they believed the regime's promise that sacrifice today would produce strength tomorrow. That promise has been broken, publicly, in front of everyone, with no credible explanation offered. Power cuts in Tehran now last up to 12 hours daily. Fuel queues stretch for kilometers. Food prices have risen more than 40%. Hospitals are reporting medicine shortages. Cancer treatments have been suspended. Chronic patients cannot access medication. ATMs in multiple cities went empty. Small businesses are closing across the country. And President Pezeshkian reportedly told IRGC commanders directly, not publicly, but in a private warning to the men who actually control the country, that if a ceasefire is not reached, the economy will completely collapse within 3 to 4 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks. Iran's 2026 to 2027 budget tells the story in numbers. Oil revenue's share of the national budget collapsed from 32% to 5%, the lowest level recorded since the 1960s. To compensate, taxes were raised by over 60%. The state began what economists describe as inflationary financing, printing currency to cover obligations, invisibly transferring wealth from ordinary people to the state apparatus. The resistance economy was never a policy, it was a slogan, and the people who paid for that slogan with their savings, their businesses, and their children are now in the streets demanding answers. But here is the moment that shook the regime in a way it has no prepared response for. During the protests that erupted in January 2026, crowds in cities across the country began chanting for the return of the Shah. Not quietly, not in isolated corners, openly. The House of Commons documented it. Voices demanding the restoration of the monarchy, demanding the return of Reza Pahlavi, rose publicly and repeatedly within the movement. This is not simply a political preference. This is an existential threat to the Islamic Republic at its most fundamental level. The entire reason this regime exists, its entire founding mythology, was constructed on the destruction of the Shah's monarchy. If Iranians 47 years later are publicly saying they want back what was overthrown, the revolution's legitimacy has not merely weakened, it has inverted. The regime responded the way it always responds. Security forces opened fire. In the days surrounding January 8th and 9th, thousands were killed and mass arrests followed. But then came something that belongs in a different category entirely. The state issued a direct threat to the families of those detained. Attend the state-organized rally on February 11th, Revolution Day, or watch your relative's sentence increase. The crowds that filled the streets waving flags on Revolution Day were not entirely there by choice. Some of them were there to save someone they loved. And when footage of the crackdown spread internationally, the regime deployed its final available tool. State-aligned media and hardline clerics declared that all street footage was AI-generated, that every video showing violence was digitally fabricated, that the reality the world was witnessing was a manufactured lie. When a regime can no longer hide what it is doing, it declares reality itself to be false. Now comes the development that no one predicted, including those who predicted everything else. For 35 days after the selection of the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, there was no image, no public appearance, no live address, only written statements read aloud by others. The supreme leader of Iran, theoretically the apex of all power in the Republic, has been invisible during the most critical weeks in the Islamic Republic's modern history. Reports indicate he sustained injuries. The nature and severity remain unconfirmed. But the effect requires no confirmation. In the vacuum he left behind, the 3-person IRGC committee moved quickly and completely. This is what makes this moment structurally unlike anything Iran has experienced since 1979. In 1989, when Ayatollah Khomeini died, a functioning clerical and civilian command structure managed the transition within hours. Rafsanjani and the incoming supreme leader Ali Khamenei coordinated a seamless handover. The system held because there was a system. That system no longer exists. What exists in its place is a military committee with no democratic mandate, no clerical legitimacy, no public accountability, and no clear chain of command above it. And that committee is now facing something it did not anticipate: pressure from within the IRGC itself. The targeting operations of late March did not just hit infrastructure, they penetrated the organization's sense of invulnerability. Commanders who believed themselves protected in cities considered safe zones were found and eliminated. Figures within Tehran's internal security apparatus, individuals connected to the organization responsible for domestic control, were hunted in locations they believed unreachable. The effect inside a security organization is more dangerous than any external assault. Paranoia. Commanders are reducing communication with each other. Internal channels are being restricted. The question of who is feeding intelligence to Mossad or allied agencies is being asked about everyone. When a military organization cannot trust its own communication, cannot trust its own officers, and cannot identify where its information is leaking, its operational capacity does not just degrade, it begins to collapse inward without a single additional strike being required. It is in that atmosphere that the demand has surfaced, the demand that would have meant immediate execution just 12 months ago. Senior IRGC figures, according to sources operating inside Iran, are privately circulating a position. The supreme leader must step aside. His invisible leadership during this crisis has deepened the collapse rather than contained it. His selection, rushed and opaque, has produced a figurehead who cannot command, cannot be seen, and cannot simultaneously stabilize 3 wars burning beneath him at every layer of the state. This is precisely what separates the current moment from every previous crisis the Islamic Republic has survived. In 2009, the Green Movement rose from below. The regime's power structure remained unified above it and crushed it completely. In 2019 and 2022, the uprisings were broader and more sustained, but they still met a coherent state security response. In every previous crisis, the IRGC was the instrument of suppression. It stood with the leadership. It absorbed the pressure. It restored order. Today, the IRGC is not standing with the leadership. Today, the IRGC is the crisis. When the organization built to protect the supreme leader begins questioning whether the supreme leader should remain, what you have is no longer a government managing unrest. What you have is a state in freefall. Iran's external partners are watching with alarm they will not express in public. China continues purchasing Iranian oil, but the question of who authorizes the contracts, who guarantees delivery, and who can be held accountable for any disruption has no clear answer. Russia, which built a military and strategic relationship with Iran through drone technology and coordinated proxy operations, no longer knows with certainty who speaks for Tehran in any binding agreement. At every negotiating table where Iran holds a seat, the other side is now calculating whether the person across from them has the actual authority to deliver on anything they commit to. That calculation is corrosive. And it is happening simultaneously in every direction. A state with no clear leadership, a fractured military command, an economically broken population, and a legitimacy crisis reaching back to the revolution's founding mythology is not simply unstable. It is approaching a threshold that history has documented before with notable consistency. The Soviet Union did not fall because the West defeated it militarily. It collapsed because the people running the system stopped believing in it. The thousands of party officials who kept the machinery moving simply stopped moving it. Gorbachev did not destroy the USSR. The quiet withdrawal of belief destroyed it. Assad did not fall because of bombs alone. He fell because the generals who were supposed to hold the line chose not to. One by one, the pillars of the system decided the structure was no longer worth the cost of holding up. And then, very suddenly, it was gone. The Shah of Iran commanded one of the most modern, best-equipped militaries in the entire region. His regime appeared formidable from every external measurement. But when the soldiers were ordered to fire on the people, they lowered their weapons. When a military refuses to defend a regime, the regime has already ended. The ceremony simply has not been scheduled yet. Consider what exists simultaneously in Iran right now. A supreme leader who cannot appear in public during the worst crisis of his tenure. A president who cannot form his own cabinet. A 3-person military committee governing by default with no constitutional basis. A clerical establishment watching its reason for existence dissolve in real time. Parliamentarians calling for the removal of their own diplomats. A population that has lost water, power, medicine, and savings simultaneously. Protesters drawn from the regime's own former base now chanting for the revolution's overthrow. IRGC commanders too afraid to communicate freely with one another, and whispers growing louder by the day that the supreme leader must go. This is not a single problem with a waiting solution. It is a system failing simultaneously at every structural layer that holds a state together. And perhaps the most strategically significant dimension of this collapse is what did not cause it. No army crossed Iran's border. No overwhelming military campaign destroyed its capacity to function. No coalition force demanded its surrender. A card was surrendered voluntarily. A sentence was spoken in a social media post, and Iran did the rest entirely to itself. The most powerful weapon deployed against the Islamic Republic across 47 years of confrontation was not a missile, not a sanction, not an invasion. It was the distance between what the regime promised its people for half a century and what those people could see with their own eyes. When a regime tells its people for 47 years that it will never surrender, and then surrenders, it does not lose a political argument. It loses the only thing that ever held the loyalty of its base. It loses the story. And without the story, what remains? Flags still wave, slogans still echo, rallies are still organized, some with attendance enforced by threats against absent families. The courts are still open, the security forces are still present, the television stations are still broadcasting. But underneath all of it, something fundamental has fractured. The people who once believed are now questioning. The commanders who once protected are now calculating. The clerics who once led are now watching, and the guards who once suppressed are now whispering. This is precisely how regimes end throughout history, not in a single dramatic explosion, not in a moment that can be predicted in advance. They end in the slow, invisible withdrawal of belief. Each person, each unit, each institution quietly decides the structure is no longer worth the cost of holding up. And then, when the one final blow arrives, there is nothing left to absorb it. The question no one can answer right now, not in Washington, not in Beijing, not in Moscow, and certainly not in Tehran, is whether that moment is still approaching or whether it has already arrived. What is not in question is this. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not the same entity it was 6 months ago. The men running it are not the men who were supposed to run it. The loyalty holding it together is not the loyalty that once made it unbreakable. And the story it told its people, the story that survived 47 years of pressure from every direction, is no longer being believed by the people it was told to. A regime can survive poverty, it can survive war, it can survive decades of international isolation. It cannot survive the moment its own foundation stops believing the story. Iran may have just crossed that threshold, and what follows will not only change Iran, it will redraw the architecture of power across the entire Middle East, reset the calculations of every government in the region, and answer a question that has remained open since 1979. How long can a revolution survive when the people who were supposed to protect it have already decided, quietly and privately, that it is no longer worth saving? We publish daily analysis on the stories that are reshaping global power. If this kind of depth is what you're looking for, you're already in the right place. Subscribe so you never have to search for it.